Minimalism is a difficult term to define. I suspect there are a number of different opinions about that, but for me it is suggested in music that seems to have been pared down to bare essentials. A lot of music, particularly 20th century music, has become very complex, and I see it in a sense in the works of Pärt, Taverner and so on as a kind of reaction against that, to try to make things simple once again. I suppose that's comparable in some ways with what happened at the time of the Reformation, when there was a reaction, at least in clerical circles, against what was thought to be overly complex contrapuntal textures. And Palestrina's Missa Pape Marcelli, for example, is supposed to be a reaction to that. And in England you had, with the emerging Anglican Church, of course, things like the short service setting, where texts were set once again syllable per note, one syllable per note. The question of how the performer and listener pays attention to music as it unfolds is a very interesting one. I think it's become harder for us in this modern age where music is all around us and available at the touch of a button. It's become harder to be sure that one is really concentrating and paying full attention to what one is hearing. It may be that the popularity of minimalism is that it appears, at least on the surface, to require less active attention because the textures are simpler, there's not a huge amount of complex counterpoint and so on. On the other hand, precisely because minimalist pieces set up very large time spans sometimes, it does require a close attention, because if the attention wanders, then the listener is not able to perceive the structures which sometimes work over long periods of time. Of course, much of the music that the King's College Choir sings is presented in the context of a liturgy, most usually evensong. And minimalist music, I think, has been very helpful as an aid for people seeking either religious solace or spiritual comfort of one kind or another, because it does enable one to move into a stillness and a quietness, in a sense, as time appears to unfold more slowly than it does in the business of life outside. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's become very popular, because it does provide that much needed help to people. In one of our concerts in this series, we're going to be presenting Vespers for King Henry VI. This will be sung in Latin, and until we get to the Magnificat and the Marian antiphon at the end, for which we're going to use settings from the Eden Choir book, until we get there, it's going to be exclusively Gregorian chant. And I think that apart from the inherent interest in the text and the way that the antiphons are chosen, especially to reflect Henry VI and his life, there's also a kind of almost a mantra set up by the regularity of the psalm verses. So the antiphons are relatively complex music in terms of Gregorian chant, whereas the psalm tones are very simple and really minimalist and set up this rhythm, I think, or in a sense lack of it. Later we're going to be doing Arvo Pärt's Passio. We've done quite a lot of Arvo Pärt's music over the years and been lucky enough that he's come to hear us perform some of it, and so I hope we have a good sense of how this can be presented in an authentic way. The Passion has, like so much minimalist music, a number of elements which recur very often. So you have the main protagonists, you have a solo quartet, you have some instruments, and you have the interpolations by the full choir. And it sets up, for me, an extraordinary stillness of time. It seems that time stops for the duration of the piece until we get to the huge outburst at the end with the full organ and the choir. And in my experience, when we've done that piece before, that is a truly shattering moment. Of course, there are certain names very strongly linked with minimalism. Arvo, Pärt, Taverner are some of them. But for me, some works by composers such as Stravinsky or Peter Maxwell Davies, to mention two, also have a kind of minimalist aspect to them. Stravinsky's setting of the Lord's Prayer, for example, is a syllabic setting, one note per syllable, quite slow-moving harmony, quite repetitive harmony in some ways, but yet harking back to the ancient chants of the Orthodox Church. And it seems to me that that is an example of where Stravinsky takes away all complexity and presents notes in absolutely straightforward and clearly audible terms. And it's something I think that probably influenced Peter Maxwell Davies when he wrote the carol One Star at Last for us back in the 1980s. It's not easy to sing in that the intervals are quite tricky, but when one has conquered those difficulties, the piece emerges as something like a burnished stone, a precious stone, in which everything is just in its right place. And I couldn't imagine that you could have a different note here or a different note there. It just seems so logical, just a little miniature masterpiece. My job here at King's involves the recruitment and training of members of the choir, that's to say the choral scholars who are students here at the university, and also the children who sing. They come to us in year 4 at school when they're about 8.5 and stay for 5 years. And I like to think that by the time they leave us, after this period of training, that they're all little professional musicians in embryo. That's to say, they have a good understanding of the rudiments of music and have become quite proficient sight readers. But more important still, that they've developed a love of music which will sustain them throughout their lives, whether they work in the musical profession or in other jobs later on. So it's very important to me that we keep a steady flow of talented youngsters coming into the choir, and I'm always very glad to hear from anybody who knows of a potential singer or organist. They only have to be in touch with me.